Hello, my name is Anuradha Dugal. I'm the Vice President of Community Initiatives at Canadian Women's Foundation. Welcome to today's Signal for Help campaign webinar. I'm going to make some remarks in English and also je vais parler un peu en français pour tester votre interprétation en même temps. At the bottom of the screen, you will find a button, Interprify, and there you can select, with a drop-down menu, you can select English subtitles and French audio and French subtitles. Vous pouvez choisir en bas de l'écran un menu et vous pouvez choisir source qui est les sous-titrés en anglais ou l'audio en français avec les sous-titres en français en même temps. Vous pouvez faire ce choix maintenant. So thank you for joining us. The work of Canadian Women's Foundation and that of the programs we support take place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an effort to make right with all our relations. For 30 years, the Canadian Women's Foundation has been Canada's foundation for gender equality. We support women, girls, and two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people to move out of violence, out of poverty, and into confidence and leadership. Today, as we are in the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, we'll be learning about the Signal for Help campaign, more on what it means to prevent and end gender-based violence and shock-proof communities for further spikes in the pandemic. Please make sure that after the event, you fill out our feedback form, which you'll get by email. This will help us do better next time. We're also recording this event to share afterwards. Please note that we cannot see any of your faces in the recording. There'll be a short Q&A period later on. There is a button on the right of your screen. You can type your questions in the Q&A box. As you can see, we have interpretation today. So please, let's all do our best to speak in a paced manner to make it easier for the interpreters and the captioners. Of course, today we will also be addressing gender-based violence and other difficult contexts. Please take care of yourself along the way, step away if you need to, and come back when you're ready. If you would like to find support services in your region, you can visit our website at canadianwomen's.org. And I think there's a link right now in your chat. The Canadian Women's Foundation's efforts to address gender-based violence spikes in the pandemic have been made possible by women and gender equality, and we thank them for their support. I'm now going to pass the floor to the Honourable Minister Marci Ien, Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth.
So I wanted to thank you so much for that introduction. Very kind of you. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you, speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Wendat and the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. J'aurais aimé d'être avec vous en personne, mais je suis reconnaissante que nous nous réunissons virtuellement pour discuter de problèmes importants comme la violence fondée sur le genre. Est-ce que nous faisons pour y répondre? We are almost halfway, as mentioned, into the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And the theme this year is 16 days and beyond. This isn't about just 16 days. It's looking at beyond those 16 days and what we need to do. A call to action for all Canadians to prevent and eliminate all forms of gender-based violence. As I said, not only during these 16 days, but all the time. We heard and will hear about the Signal for Help and how it was viral. 1 in 3 people in Canada know about the signal or have seen it used. We saw it go viral on social media, including TikTok. This Signal for Help has been able to create real change in our society and, in fact, save lives. It is simply incredible. But even with all the progress we have made, and we've made some, we still hear, I have heard, countless stories about how people don't believe survivors of gender-based violence. And even when survivors seek help, sometimes they are pushed even further into the margins by the systems that do not support them well. This needs to stop now. And we know that we'll only truly change the culture of stigma surrounding abuse by continuing to support organizations doing this work at the grassroots level. Le lancement de la campagne d'aujourd'hui est un pas important dans la bonne direction. The COVID-19 crisis has taught us many lessons. It has magnified existing inequities and underscored the need for urgent action. We have to do better. We must do better. We cannot be what we were. Many organizations providing GBV-related supports and services have reported a significant increase in demand and a rise in the severity of the cases. I was in Halifax a couple of weeks ago and was at a Mi'kmaq Friendship Center and heard firsthand about the number of women that are seeking help there and how those numbers have gone up. The pandemic brought new challenges like movement restrictions, loss of income, things like isolation, overcrowding, stress, stigma, and anxiety to victims and survivors of gender-based violence. Our government recognizes this and is proud to work closely with the Canadian Women's Foundation to make a difference in the lives of women, girls, and gender-diverse individuals, and supporting frontline organizations like those gathered here today. Your organizations, your teams, your tireless volunteers have been and continue to be at the front lines of this crisis. Thank you so very much. I can't say that enough. Thank you. We have seen how challenging your work is and the ingenuity of your projects to address the constraints put in place because of COVID, and whether it's adapting your programming by offering virtual group sessions on the fly or providing personal protective equipment, adding additional transportation options, or offering new services. You have been there and you have done it. You have pivoted in a time of crisis. Please know that you're saving lives just by keeping your programs running. The Mi'kmaq Friendship Center that I talked about said, we have a small team, but we're a mighty team. And we put on our PPE and we kept going. We are still going. We haven't stopped. It is about keeping those programs running and keeping the doors open. To end gender-based violence, we must continue to work together. No one should face violence because of who they are, yet for far too many women, girls, and people of diverse gender identities and gender expressions, this is their terrifying reality. This is life. We know that certain communities have a significantly greater risk of experiencing gender-based violence. Young women, Indigenous women and girls, Black and racialized women, LGBTQ2 individuals, people with disabilities, as well as women living in northern, rural, and remote communities. This is frankly unacceptable, and we have taken swift action to help those who need it most. Our government has committed almost $300 million to support Canadians experiencing gender-based violence during as well as beyond this pandemic. To date, more than 1,200 organizations have received funding. These are frontline organizations, shelter organizations, to provide supports and services to 1.3 million people. We're working with partners to advance the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence, supported by an investment of $601.3 million over 5 years, and that is through budget 2021. This plan will ensure that anyone experiencing gender-based violence has reliable, and not just reliable, but timely access, because that is really important, to protection and services, no matter where they are, no matter where they live. We're also striving to ensure that women's and equality-seeking organizations have access to resources and supports to continue providing these critical services throughout this pandemic, and I'm going to use the word again, and beyond. While there is much to celebrate, we still have much, much, much to do. We know where the gaps are, and it is now up to us to keep moving the needle forward. No single person, no single government or organization can create wide-scale, lasting change by themselves, but together, we are empowered. We are strong. We are well on track to meet our goals. As the new Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, I want to assure each and every one of you here today that you have a committed partner at the federal level. Thank you to the Canadian Women's Foundation for bringing us together today. Working together, I hope for a better, a safer future for our daughters, our granddaughters, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts. I want to hear from you. I look forward to hearing from you and hearing about the great work you are doing in your communities. Thank you again. Merci à tous.
Thank you to the Minister, and thank you to WAGE and the government for their ongoing support. I will now pass the floor to President and CEO of Canadian Women's Foundation, Paulette Senior.
Thank you so much, Anu, and thank you, Minister Ien. Such a pleasure to have you with us, as well as our dear friends and partners who have joined us today. I want to personally thank all of you for your tirelessness in supporting survivors of gender-based violence during this challenging time. Your efforts are nothing short of life-saving, as the minister alluded to, but you cannot do it alone. We cannot do it alone. It takes a broad-based systemic change for gender justice, and that is what we're working towards. And everyone has to be part of that change effort in their own lives. This is why we launched a signal for help, a one-handed gesture that means I need you to check in with me safely. So it's incredible to see the signal for help enter the mainstream. This doesn't happen often in our sector. So upon entering the mainstream, from going viral on TikTok and other social media to making headlines when people use it and are able to get the help that they need and actually deserve. But does everyone know how to respond? That is the question that we're dealing with today. That is what this event is about, is how do we actually respond in a way that is supportive? And sometimes we just don't know. And it's not something that we talk about enough. So I'm going to be joined by my colleague who will share more about the Signal for Help Responder campaign. But first, I invite you to watch this video.
Hi, everyone. I think we might have had a bit of a sound issue, so we're going to try to show that again a little bit later. But as I'm here on screen, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to chat about the Signal Responder campaign. I'm Andrea. I'm with the Canadian Women's Foundation, and this is me in the 1990s, looking fresh with some of my stylish family members. So this picture was taken on a very happy day of celebration, but I'll tell you about a time that I witnessed a family member get harmed in an abusive relationship and threatened by her husband. This happened at about the same age that I was at this picture. I froze. I remember how my body felt. I was sweating and shaking, and my stomach dropped. I was scared for her life, and I said nothing. I was afraid I would make things worse, and I never meaningfully followed up with her. I didn't know what to say, and I wanted to forget that it happened. How about you? Have you ever witnessed something like this? And how did you respond? At the same time, I was very young. I was thinking, I need somebody to show me how to do the right thing now. I need to know I'm not the only one who sees this and knows something is wrong. I'm older now. I think I would respond differently, given the great mentorship I've gotten from gender-based violence, like many of you here today, gender-based violence advocates. Thank you for showing me. But I know that many people do not know how to respond. And sometimes we focus so heavily on the person facing abuse, like it's their responsibility to fix what's happening. We don't pay enough attention to the people around them who see what's going on and don't respond. What tools do these people need to respond? That's why we're really excited about the Signal for Help campaign and the Signal Responder work that we're trying to do. I had the privilege of trying to help with this and creating a guide with the kind of information that I wish I had. And I think it's perfectly normal to feel upset and uncertain when you witness signs and signals of violence. But I think the truth is we need to not freeze up. We need to be able to be compassionate and competent responders. As mentioned, the Signal for Help is a one-handed gesture you can make to say you need somebody to help check in with you without leaving a digital trace. We launched it in April 2020 in response to the spike in gender-based violence risks, but also the fact that people would be using video calls more often. And by July 2020, it went viral. It garnered a lot of attention and awards, and I think it met a need and it struck a nerve. And we've learned of some incidents when people used the signal and were able to get the support that they needed, and that is good. But we're saddened that something like this even needs to exist in the first place. And we know for as many instances we hear about, there's many that don't make the news. So on November 25th, the launch of the 16 Days of Activism, we launched the Signal for Help Responder campaign to give tools and training to support survivors of violence and help those around them be able to have judgment-free conversations. It aims to build these folks' competency and confidence in supporting survivors and putting them first. The goal is to change our culture of stigma to a culture of support. We did a poll recently that found that 64% of people in Canada know a woman who has experienced sexual, physical, or emotional abuse in their lifetimes. But we know that only 1 in 6 people feel very confident that they would know what to say or do to support somebody dealing with sexual or emotional abuse. And it's actually 1 in 5 when it comes to physical abuse. So there's a gap. There's a gap in our knowledge of this issue that's happening and our confidence and competency in being able to respond to it well. And of course, we know that the Signal for Help and any tools like it are of little value if we don't know how to respond. So we're asking everyone to download the Signal Responder Action Guide. It gives quick tips on how to support survivors of abuse, no matter how it becomes clear to you that they need support. And it invites you to sign up for more tools and trainings to go on a learning journey over the next 18 months, because learning never happens in just one day. And we know, of course, that so many people in Canada, so many women, girls, and trans, two-spirit, non-binary people know what it's like to be targeted because of gender injustice and discrimination that we face. These are all interlocking, and it's really serious. And chances are, on this island, Turtle Island that we're on, we know somebody who needs our support and we can help. The Signal for Help Responder campaign is just one piece of the puzzle to help shock-proof our communities from gender-based violence in times of crisis, because it doesn't have to be this way and violence is not inevitable. We can address the spikes in violence now and in the future. It's society, it's community, it's individual. It's research on how to change policies and practices to shock-proof communities against violence. It's funds, it's grants for people doing service work, gender-based violence prevention and intervention in the pandemic emergency process and in the recovery process as well. And it's the Signal Responder campaign, tools to help change our culture of stigma to a culture of support. So please remember to check it out and share it. At the end of this launch, you can learn more. There will be exhibitor booths at the end, 3 booths, and one of them will be about the Signal Responder campaign. One will also be about the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence, and one will also be about shock-proofing our communities against violence research. And thank you so much for listening, and I will pass it back to Anu for the rest of the session. Thank you.
I stayed out of it.
I wondered if it was any of my business.
I kept quiet.
I haven't always known how to help.
But not anymore.
Because if you're experiencing abuse,
If I see you use the Violence at Home Signal for help, I will text Signal to 540-540 to know how to respond.
I will not judge you.
I will know what to do.
I will help you.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much. So now you see what the video was. And we are going to move into a panel right now with some grantees who have been doing gender-based violence work in very particular circumstances during the pandemic, like so many organizations have. We do have one more video for the Safer and Stronger grant. So we'll show that, and then afterwards Paulette will introduce you to our panel. Thank you.
The Victoria Faulkner Women's Centre in Whitehorse, Yukon is a safe place where women and their children can access services, support, and connection. The centre offers drop-in space and programming, housing support, parenting and peer support, and help with everyday needs like healthy meals, hot showers, computer access, and baby supplies. The risk of gender-based violence in Canada has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Yukon, where rates of gender-based violence are already much higher than the national average, the impact has been significant. The pandemic has also limited access to emergency shelters and caused the price of food and other necessities to spike. The Victoria Faulkner Women's Centre has struggled to meet an increased need for services and necessities, and public health measures have led to a pause in peer support and drop-in programs. Many women in this community were left feeling isolated, unsafe, and alone, without a place they could feel at home. With the help of a safer and stronger emergency grant, the centre was able to open an off-site space to hold drop-in and peer support programs, respond to an increased need for grocery and laundry vouchers, temporarily shift their on-site meal program to a takeout meal service, and address some of the isolation and loneliness that women in the community are facing. The Victoria Faulkner Women's Centre is just one part of the network of community service providers working for gender justice in Canada. But they can't do it alone. Your help is essential. Donate now at canadianwomen.org.
Thank you so much, Anu. And that particular video that you just saw actually gives you an idea of the impact of the Safer, Stronger grants that we've distributed across the country, but this one in particular in Whitehorse, Yukon. And with the critical support of women and gender equality through the ministry, we've distributed these grants in every province and territory to address the spike of gender-based violence need for support in the pandemic. In total, 518 organizations were funded to meet the needs of survivors of violence at this very difficult time. But what does it mean to prevent violence? So in situations of crisis and disaster, we actually don't see the spikes. And that's really what we have to work towards and that we want to work towards. So allow me now to introduce or call on screen two of our grantee panelists who have joined us today. It's my pleasure to introduce Kim Hawkins, who is the Executive Director of Rise Women's Legal Center that's located in Vancouver. And so welcome, Kim, great to have you with us. And also Wyan Sandler. Wyan is the Executive Director of the Antigonish Women's Resource Center and Sexual Assault Services Association. We're almost going from coast to coast with our panelists today. So I welcome you both and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as we speak, please remember to ask your questions of myself and the minister in the Q&A box, which we will be able to take up later in the session. So, Wyan and Wendy wasn't able to join, but Wyan and Kim, I'd like to just ask you a couple of questions, and they're big questions that I'm sure you'll need some time to respond, but let's start with the first one. So as we know, communities are unique across the country. So in your unique community, please take a moment to give us a sense of the key solution that needs to happen to prevent spikes in gender-based violence. So we know we've seen the spikes. We want to prevent the spikes from happening, but what do you think from your perspective and your community would be a key solution to actually prevent the spikes from happening during disasters?
Thank you, Paulette. My name is actually Vonda Nasood. I'm stepping in for Kim Hawkins from Rise Women's Legal Center. I'm the supervising lawyer of the Student Clinic. So I'm coming to you from Vancouver, BC, the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We're a community legal center. We provide accessible legal services to self-identifying women. So what we think needs to happen is the most important thing is to believe survivors and listen to survivors. What we found is that positive social supports are one of the biggest ways to assist. So for example, when survivors report violence and are ignored or not believed, they're much more likely to stop asking for help. So we would say that women, what we need is that the responses from friends and family and professionals are supportive and are listening and believing.
Much, and my apologies, Vandana. I didn't even see that the change was made, so I apologize for that. But thank you for your response. And I'd like to pose the same question to Ien, whose name I'm sure I've gotten right.
You have, yeah. Thank you, Paulette. And yeah, I would, really agree with what Vandana has shared. I think that, starting with believing is very important. Making sure that survivors have access to supports and choice. In terms of responses. I think that in terms of prevention work and thinking about our particular community here, I'm based in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and we're here in Antigonish, which is a small rural community in northeastern Nova Scotia. And we serve a lot of rural and isolated communities. And so, thinking about how we, support people in rural communities, women and gender diverse people in rural communities, how we reach out, how we combat that isolation, because even something like the Signal for Help campaign, if you're not seeing people, if people are already physically isolated, I think it takes creative solutions in terms of breaking down that isolation. So, some of the things that we were able to do with the emergency funding, which came through Women and Gender Equality Canada and was delivered by the Canadian Women's Foundation, was really like doing a lot of outreach work. So, we did things like public service announcements on the radio and, having big signage, letting people know that we were still here and we were still open. But we also went out into community. And so, we were meeting people where they were at, going for walks with people, meeting up at local parks and that sort of thing. So I think really going out into community, finding creative ways to break down those barriers, making sure that our services are as accessible as possible, that people see themselves represented in the staff and the programming that we have, that we're, being as inclusive and diverse and welcoming in doing that, and breaking down some of those barriers. And so we also, we revamped our web presence and we, tried to make our services more accessible and more easy to find online. And we learned a lot of new tools and resources in terms of virtual and remote delivery of service. But we also had to set up a connectivity fund. And so we recognized that the digital divide was very real for lower income folks, but also folks living in rural communities. And so we had to use some of those funds to try to bridge that. And so getting people access to devices and to internet services or, phone cards, all of those sorts of things was really important because people didn't necessarily have have access to that. And it just furthered that isolation when everything moved online. So I think those are important things to consider. But when we think about prevention, I think we really need to start to think about some of those systemic changes. So, you know, a lot of what I've been talking about is really about response. And when we think about prevention, I think we absolutely need to be looking at, you know, economic justice, about, you know, addressing systemic racism and discrimination. And so we need to be looking at those things. We need to be looking at the housing crisis. We need to be looking at childcare. All of those things are very important, because one of the biggest challenges that we faced during the pandemic was people who were in urgent situations that needed to move, and there was nowhere for them to go. And so, you know, the housing crisis has been something that I think we've certainly been coming up against. Those are the sorts of investments that we need. That's the sort of systemic change that we need to be looking at as we look toward prevention, I think.
So much for your comprehensive responses, and really pointing out the difference between having to respond at a moment of crisis, but also what it is that we need in the long term. And what we say at the foundation, that we need the kinds of investments that will actually make sure that we are shock-proofing women and gender diverse folks from being so vulnerable and being in these kinds of precarious circumstances that prevent them from being able to move forward with their lives during crisis, but all times. So thank you for that. And also, I was interested in having you share with us what you think needs to happen to shift society's culture of stigma and silencing of survivors of violence to a culture that is supportive, that listens, where the stigma doesn't silence folks. Would you like to go first, Vandana?
Sure. So from our perspective, what we're doing is we're providing legal services. So it's a specific part of the types of services that women may need, either because they need a protection order and they need something strong, they need child support, or they're finding themselves dragged into court and they need help with that right away. So what we need at this point is, we, again, as professionals, we need to believe women, and we need to consider how violence that they have faced and may be facing currently and in the future is going to impact how they move through the legal system. What we found at RISE is that calls for our client-facing services, which are provided by law students and volunteer lawyers, doubled by the fall after the pandemic was declared, and right now have actually tripled. So numbers have not gone back down. Numbers are staying really high. But what we need systemically is we need much broader change. We need women to have access to lawyers. We need survivors to have, we need robust legal aid systems. So what the funding helped us do was to make up for some of those, to handle the increased number of clients coming in and be able to provide them services, to bring in a senior lawyer on contract. And so there's a reluctance, particularly in the court system, to talk about family violence, but we do have the new Divorce Act, which has a much more robust definition of family violence and allows survivors across Canada, not just in BC, to talk about what they are facing and to access solutions and tools to help them keep themselves and their children safe. And that's a good change in the legislation, but we also need that change to be reflected on the ground in the court system, in how lawyers are practicing, in the types of training that is being given both to all of the legal actors in the legal system, so that this some of the stereotypes about violence are being left behind, and we are shifting to a culture of listening to and believing survivors in the professional capacity as well in terms of survivors' communities.
Thank you. And Diane?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's important for us to be thinking about ending gender-based violence as a community and collective need, and rather than sort of, I think there can be a tendency, and I think stigma tends to grow out of this to individualize violence. So to make it about that those people, that person or that relationship or that family, rather than seeing this really as a societal issue, a collective and community issue, and addressing the sort of systemic roots of that. And so I think that part of it is shifting that focus from the individual to the systemic. And again, I think it's about creating more supports for people, more opportunities for people, really addressing some of the I think vulnerabilities that can contribute to those situations. And so that would be, I guess, my perspective on how I do think it is about a shift from, this being an individual problem or a private problem to really seeing this as all of our responsibilities and requiring that kind of systemic and societal change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you, Diane, Vandana. And I know that Paulette had a bit of an issue with her tech, so I just want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your experiences here with us. I think it's so important for us to remember that it isn't an individual issue and it's not a survivor's fault. It's all of us changing policies and practices and systems, and of also us being there personally for our friends and family who are more likely to come to us than to other people or go to 911 or emergency services, or even sometimes shelter services and crisis lines. Sometimes we are the connector between those things. And I thank you that you are here today and sharing that experience. So I'm going to pass it back to Anu. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and I'd like to invite Minister Ien to come back, and also Paulette, when you're ready, please join us. And we do have some questions from the audience in the Q&A, and I will remind you as we're talking that you can certainly add questions to the Q&A as we go through. There's a box on the right-hand side of your screen. So I'm just going to start with the first question. This is for the Minister. And we'd like to know what key legislative changes are you excited about in the coming months that will address gender-based violence?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. And Anu, and to the person that asked it, I come from a research background. As a former journalist, although I say once a journalist, always a journalist. And so for me, it is being on the ground and understanding what people need and understanding where the gaps are. One of the first things I said to my team was, please get me on the road, because I want to meet with people. I want to see what's happening. I want to see where we need to do better. I want to see, frankly, what's working. And so I have heard back from them. And one of the recurring themes, I should say, is that we need more representation when it comes to our grassroots organizations, more cultural representation. So I had mentioned the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center that I visited in Halifax, and Pam, who runs the center. And she had said to me that they, as I said, put their PPE on and did not stop because the numbers were just going up, 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 up. And then she said, comparatively though, the province didn't see the rise in numbers that they saw. And we had what I thought was a very interesting discussion about cultural representation and the fact that women were coming to the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center because they saw themselves. And they were coming to counselors who they knew shared lived experiences and where they felt comfortable. And so that is something that I want to see more of. It's one of the places I think there is a gap and that we need to do better. So there is that. And I say this from a new minister who hasn't even gotten a mandate letter yet, and to see the direction on where I'm meant to go. But that is definitely one place where I think we can do better and must do better, because if there's a disparity in numbers between the province and grassroots organizations on the ground, then we've got to close that gap.
But would you like to add anything? I'm seeing you nod and react.
Perhaps I can build off of what the minister said, because from another perspective as well, the women simply do not trust the authorities in the same way. And therefore, there's an issue of trust to deal with. And when you think of Indigenous women, such as you mentioned, Black and racialized women, women with disabilities, the responses have not been to their benefit traditionally. And so, and also, just to build off of the previous conversation, we live in a culture where women have been silenced, as well as shamed into disclosing issues around gender-based violence and abuse. And so that is part of the issue as well. And so I'm looking forward to campaigns such as this and others that can actually create a culture that can reduce the stigma or eliminate it completely, or and that there's an investment by government and others to address the stigma and to reduce the shame or eliminate the shame that folks who have experienced gender-based violence face. That then prevents them from actually being able to seek the help they need or to leave the situations they're in. So issues around, when I think of legislative changes or just investments that need to be made, I know I'm thinking about housing. I'm thinking about childcare, all the things that women in particular consider in terms of the situations that they're caught in, where if they're have children with them, it's their first thought is what's going to happen to my children. And so if they can't count on the kind of system's response in terms of what their specific needs are, then becomes impossible for them to actually leave. And we know statistics have told us that women make many attempts, several attempts to actually leave before they actually can leave or do leave if they choose to do that. So we need the kind of responses that will make it possible and not impossible in order for that to happen. And legislative changes are needed for some of that, the kinds of investments that will make sure that they don't fall between the cracks when they do decide to leave or to escape a violent situation.
I absolutely agree, Paulette. And Anu, if I might add a few things as to what Paulette covered, a lot of ground there. You are so right that when women decide to leave, when they have to leave, there's so many barriers there. And you mentioned children. I represent Toronto Centre, and I know for a fact, and this is represented across the country, women were disproportionately impacted during this pandemic. And you take that number and you multiply it by 10 when you look at Indigenous and racialized women, because they were on the front lines. I know for sure in my riding, mostly on the front lines, working the jobs that helped us all to get through and are continuing to get through this pandemic. And then there are children. They're the caregivers for their kids. caregivers often for seniors as well. So all these different layers that they have to think about, and they do so with empathy to their own detriment. And so to introduce something like childcare, which we are doing, and we saw that as a government, the number of people that have said to us, listen, it's completely unaffordable. We know that it is. To have that cut in half by the end of this year is huge. To have $10 a day childcare, and almost every province and territory has signed on. We know which ones have not. But almost every province and territory have signed on. To have $10 a day childcare is a game changer, a huge game changer that would take away one of those big barriers, that women who are trying to leave abuse would face. What am I going to do? How am I going to afford to do things? That takes a big chunk out of that. I'd also like to say that immediately 100 million went to shelter-based organizations to keep the door open. And this was part of the plan, right? Right away, we knew that when we told people to stay home, home is not a safe place for everyone. So immediately, shelter organizations, $100 million to make sure that those doors are kept open and that women continue to get the help they receive. My colleague in cabinet, Minister Hussein, is responsible for housing in this country and responsible for the part in budget 2021 where we reallocated 250 million in funding to support what I believe is about 560 units of transitional housing and shelter spaces for women and children fleeing violence. Those kinds of carve-outs are essential. And we are doing it, and I look forward to working with him and doing some really impactful work with regards to this file.
Thank you so much. That was a very fulsome answer and very rich. I think lots to reflect on in what you're saying. But I think what I'm hearing most of all is this idea of the enabling environment, that everything we do that surrounds a woman, we have to have a holistic approach to make sure she has every resource necessary to rebuild her life and go forward with society change as well as all of those legislative changes. So thank you so much. Our second question is around more what you're seeing elsewhere. So what are other countries doing to end gender-based violence that might be a model or something that we can look at from Canada and learn from?
Again,
sorry.
So sorry, Anu, did you want me to start?
Please, yes.
Okay. Didn't mean to cut you off there. Again, the research. So I just started kind of looking around the world, and I saw countries like Spain and Australia and the United Kingdom, Timor-Leste, Sweden, who've led national action plans and strategies to end GBV. And the countries offer important models and lessons learned that we're looking at, that I am looking at. Canada and Australia in particular, we have similar jurisdictional policies, so that's important. So their national action plan to reduce violence against women and children was from 2010 to 2022. And it's considered, when I look at it, the most relevant approach to combating GBV. So looking at using that as a model. Also, I will say, looking at the previous minister, my friend Mariam Monsaf, and the excellent work that she did along with her parliamentary secretary at the time, Terry Dogood, to look at the other part of this equation, and that is men and boys. And it's an important part of the equation. You don't have one without the other. And so I'm really interested to learn and see, as I'm rereading their report. They went across this country and they did listening sessions, and they called the report that they did Calling In Men and Boys, not calling out, but calling in, to have real discussions about what is happening, trauma-informed discussions about what is happening. And in talking to one of the leaders of the Inuit women's organization, she said something very interesting to me. She's a counselor as well. And she said, oh, we've been doing this for years. She said, we counsel men all the time because of the trauma whether it's residential schools, other trauma that they have faced. We want to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So I look forward to looking at that as well.
Well, I think the minister has really covered the other countries that I was going to mention. Thank you for mentioning Australia. And you know, I had the experience of being at the UN Commission on the Status of Women in 2009, when Australia brought forward what the architecture of their plan, or the framework of their plan, was looking like. And I was with the YWCA movement at the time, and I was working with my counterparts at the YWCA of Australia, and just recalling some of the conversations, but also a little bit of envy because the government was just so far ahead of where others were in terms of building that. So they've built out a plan that's supposed to take them, I believe it's to 2022.
Yes.
So it's a 12-year plan. And like the efforts that have gone into that is incredible. And what I liked specifically, I know about their plan, was the sort of the public campaign aspect of it, right? So a number of vignette videos that focused on different aspects of what needed to be understood about gender-based violence, really educating and raising public awareness about what is gender-based violence? What kind of supports can you offer? What are the resources available? So the government really partnered with organizations on the ground in order to create these resources and be able to direct people to the kinds of supports that they needed, and made the right investments to do that. And so that's what I really admired. And I would love to see in 2022, when they've had the evaluation results, you know, what the impact was in terms of moving the beliefs and culture forward in terms of gender-based violence, but also, you know, looking at what the incidences are. Have they kind of been reduced? You know, have the investments in terms of protecting or supporting important legislative changes like housing and childcare been put in place? And then I'm also thinking about what's happened with those organizations on the ground that's doing this work. Have they had the right kinds of supports and partnerships in order to create that? So you know, I'm always hesitant to take one particular kind of response and plant it in a country or in a community, because as Wyan and Vandana talked about earlier, the responses need to be unique to the community that it's in, you know. So it's got to have that sort of overarching framework that will provide a slew of different kinds of responses from that framework in order to be able to be effective on the ground. So the needs in Antigonish would be different from the needs in Vancouver, from the needs in Toronto, but we know the issues are the same and the systemic barriers are the same. But what would the responses be? We know rural is different from urban and suburban, et cetera, right? And northern. So I think that's what I'm excited about, is the opportunity to contribute to such a plan for Canada that will respond to our unique needs. So much more I could say, but I think I'll stop there, Anu. Thank you.
Both. And I'll just remind everybody, we are coming close to the top of the hour, so we will have to stop the questions there. But I'm reminding everybody, if you have questions and comments, you can bring them to the exhibitor booths. There's one on the National Action Plan that Minister and Paulette both explained, I think, very thoroughly. But I'm sure you have more questions about what that framework could look like, or suggestions. We can discuss that. There will be an exhibitor booth, that's hard to say, an exhibitor booth about the the signal for help, and there'll be a third one about the research on shockproofing communities. So do please join at the end of the session. You can extend your time with us and ask more questions there. So I'll pass it back to Paulette for some closing remarks, but I just want to thank our panelists one more time. Thank you, Minister, for being with us today and sharing your thoughts and plans for the future. And over to Paulette. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu, and thank you, Minister, as well. Add my thanks for you joining us. We so appreciate your voice in this conversation today. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Paulette.
Thank you. And please remember to check out signalresponder.ca. Just go to our website or just go directly to signalresponder.ca. Andrea presented the videos earlier today. So the videos are also on our website, or text signal 540540. When this presentation closes, which is in a couple minutes, go to our exhibitor booth as Anu talked about, to find more information, to talk to us and our partner up until 1:30. And so that will be available, and you'll get a feedback survey in an email, because we also want to make sure that we do better each time that we do this work. So thank you everyone for joining and for being tireless.